I haven't seen any studies making this comparison with Muslims, Hindus, or Buddhists, but compared to Christians and Jews, atheists tend to have a lower divorce rate. A long time ago, I came across a video by someone asking why so many atheist men are single. I think the two of these are related. After all, it's not just atheist men, but also women. I tend to believe that one reason, not the only one of course, that atheists tend to have a lower divorce rate is that we are also likely to have a lower marriage rate. We are less likely to divorce because we are less likely to get married in the first place. I don't happen to believe in marriage. I have difficulty believing in something I can't define, and I encounter all manner of difficulty when I try to define marriage. I once checked the dictionary and found that the definition for marriage included the word married. So I looked up married and found a definition including the word spouse. So then I looked up the word spouse and found a definition including the word marriage. So technically, before one can define marriage, one must define married. Before one can define married, one must define spouse. But then before one can define spouse, one must define marriage. Here we have an exercise in circular reasoning. In the West, or at least in the US, we grew up with images of marriage as this vague and generally wonderful thing. I can tell you from experience, guys grow up with this image of marriage as something all the women want and are also delighted to get. The women on television are all so happy when the guy finally pops the question. But in real life, the only real reason the woman ever tends to be so happy is that she has been sold on the same image. I could define it as a union of some sort between two people, but then what's group marriage? One may object to it, but ethical or not, it exists. So how does one define it? What exactly is it? What if one relies on religious definitions? If marriage is a sacred union before God, which God? One could try to insist that there's only one, but that's a different discussion. If the God in question is Christ, then what's Jewish, Muslim, or Hindu marriage? The classical era Greeks, though they had many gods in their pantheon, did not believe in Christ, but they did believe in marriage. So if marriage is a sacred union before Christ, then what was marriage in ancient Greece? What makes the union in question sacred? The fact that it's before God? If so, then the act of calling it sacred would automatically establish that it's before God, and the act of saying that it's before God would automatically establish that it's sacred. This means that the act of calling it a sacred union before God is redundant. Is it sacred because it's been blessed by this, that, or the other God? If so, then how would things go differently if it weren't blessed? Surely when you say, before God, you don't mean before as opposed to after. You mean before as in front of God as opposed to behind Him. You mean before God as in witnessed by God. Am I right? But if the God in question is indeed omniscient, then He witnesses everything, which by this logic would make everything sacred, including divorce. It's my understanding that the legal definition of marriage is usually pretty clear, but that definition changes from place to place and from time to time. So I have these questions from our religious subscribers. If you believe in marriage, how do you define it? How do you answer these questions and/or resolve these difficulties? And I have these questions from my secular subscribers. Are you married? If not, do you ever plan to be? If you plan to marry one day, or if you are married right now, then what does marriage mean to you? How do you define it? If you are married, did you marry before or after deconversion, assuming you went through a deconversion? If you are not religious and you do plan to marry, then why?